places that you need a lot of ATP is your sodium potassium ATPase, or the sodium potassium pump. Everybody's heard of that, right? The sodium potassium ATPase or sodium potassium pump. What's its job? Okay, so every time you have a cell, so here's what happens. Here's a cell, right? Everybody with me? This is a cell. So what happens is, in order for some action to take place, that cell has to what we call depolarize. That's just a fancy way of saying the inside of the cell has to become positively charged. It has to take on a positive charge so it can do some work. Think about you. If you're going to work, you want to be in a good positive state of mind before you go to work, right? Well, the same is true in the cells. The cells say, look, don't be sending me out there to do this job all sad and mad and negative. I need to be nice and positive before I go to work. So that's exactly what's happening. So what happens is, for instance, sodium goes inside of the cell, or in certain situations, it's calcium that goes inside of the cell. Either way, whether it's sodium, calcium, or other electrolytes, those are the two primary ones that go inside of the cell. It causes the inside of the cell to become more positive. So I just said two electrolytes primarily go into the cell to make it more positive. What were they? That's right. It's going to be sodium and calcium. Okay. So here's what happens. So let's put some sodium inside the cell. Let's put some calcium inside the cell. Okay. Now we've got this sodium in the cell. We got calcium inside the cell. I'm going somewhere with this. I'm just laying the foundation. Now what happens is the inside of the cell is happy, it's nice and positive. Everybody's got nice chill vibes in there. Everything's good. But the sodium went in through a concentration gradient, okay? First you had a lot of it on the outside. And then there was a driving force that caused it to go inside. Don't get caught up in the details of that right now. Just here's what I want you to know. Sodium and calcium went in through a concentration gradient. Basically, you had a higher amount on the outside and a lower amount on the inside. And so things move from high concentration to low concentration. And that's what happened. But it very easily went in, but it needs some help to get it out. So it easily went in, but now you've got to have some work to get it out. And that work comes in the form of ATP. So for instance, what happens is this sodium that comes into the cell and this calcium that comes into the cell, for instance, the sodium, the way it gets out is through what's called the sodium potassium pump, or the sodium potassium ATPase. Well, here's what happens. If you don't have ATP, like you have a disorder or a disease that's preventing you from making it, the pump doesn't work. So we need ATP to power up the sodium potassium ATPase. Everybody good with that? Does that make sense? Are you good with that? Here's where we are. The pump is not working. So now what do you think is going to happen? If the pump can't pump out the sodium or pump out the calcium, what's going to happen to the amount of sodium inside of the cell? So what's going to happen is the sodium, it gets trapped. And more and more and more and more sodium gets trapped inside of the cell because the pump is no longer working. Now, when all this sodium gets trapped in the cell, the sodium says, hey, I don't want to be here by myself. Call my cousin. And sodium calls her cousin, and her cousin's name is chlorema, which is chlorine. So here's what happens. So now we have sodium that was in the cell, and now sodium's cousin, chlorine, comes in the cell. And so we have sodium and chloride in the cell. What do you know about sodium chloride? That sounds familiar, right? Exactly. Sodium chloride is salt. So here's our situation right now. We got sodium inside the cell, on the inside of the cell. We've got sodium, we've got chlorine. So they come together, make sodium chloride. That's called salt. And what does salt like more than anything? Water. So follow me here. We now have a whole bunch of salt inside of the cell. And that whole bunch of salt says, hey, I like a whole bunch of water because I'm really thirsty. So more and more water gets trapped inside of the cell. Well, if more and more water gets trapped inside of the cell, what's going to happen to the size of the cell? If I keep putting water in there, the size of the cell is going to blow up, right? It's going to swell. Well, what I just described is exactly what happens in inflammation. So, the process of cellular inflammation, let's go back over that again. The process of cellular inflammation or swelling, and this happens all over the body. Anytime you hear somebody use the word inflammation, what we're describing is the inside of the cell becomes positive because sodium rushes into the cell, for instance. But then sodium is supposed to be pumped out through the sodium potassium pump. Well, in a disease state or a state of disorder, the pump is not working. So now the sodium gets trapped on the inside, and then it attracts its cousin chlorine into the inside of the cell. So now we got sodium inside, and now we got chlorine inside, and together they're going to make up a whole bunch of salt, for instance, right? And now what does the salt like more than anything? Water. So now we get more and more water inside of the cell. What happens to the size of the cell? It swells. That is exactly what's called inflammation. Now, when the cell starts to swell and we have this thing called inflammation, we call it something different in different body parts. So, for instance, in the head, we may not just call it inflammation in the head, we may call it increased intracranial pressure. And then when it affects the optic disc, we have another name for it. We call that papilledema. Okay, if we're in the GI tract, we may call it third spacing. If we're in the skin, we may call it lymphatic dilatation. If we're in the liver, we may call it hydropic changes. So you just heard me say a whole bunch of words, right? Increased intracranial pressure, papilledema, lymphatic dilatation, hydropic changes, third spacing, right? What you really heard me say was swelling, 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 swelling. So all I just did is I took a basic concept of inflammation, and for instance, I just showed you the how and why of swelling, and then I showed you how to apply it, for instance, and how we're going to call it something else in different body parts. Why did I take you through all of that? Because in every chronic disease, in every disease state, or in every state of a disorder, you're going to generally have some kind of swelling associated with it. Now, what happens, changes happen all over the body, but one of the biggest places you're going to see a lot of changes is in the bone marrow. Okay, why do I tell you that? Well, the bone marrow, if the bone marrow is not working as well, now you're going to have problems with your blood. Okay, and that's where the story is going to pick up from there. So,